Welcome to the Fight IQ podcast. I'm back with another episode. I've compiled a list for you guys today. And what I got on the screen right here, I just needed a page to start on. This doesn't have anything to do with the list. But the list that I've compiled for you guys today, I'm going to be going through every weight class from flyweight to heavyweight and telling you guys fighters that I think left the UFC too soon. Whether this was on their own volition and they went off to another promotion or they left the sport entirely. That's what today's list is going to be about. So let's just get into it. Flyweight. My pick for flyweight fighter who left too soon, left the UFC too soon. Muhammad Mokaev. I think a lot of you guys probably feel the same way. I think while he was in the UFC, I think we didn't really appreciate him. And let's be honest, he wasn't the most exciting fighter. Although he did have a good amount of submissions, he was kind of like that fighter that's very methodical. He's kind of boring until he eventually gets the finish. But I think now that he's gone, I think we can all appreciate him a little bit more. The beef that he had with Manel Kape, the win that he has over Manel Kape. I mean, this guy's undefeated. And let's just look at his last three wins. Tim Elliott, Alex Perez, Manel Kape. These are great wins. If I'm being completely honest with you guys, I hate watching him fight, but I can't lie to myself and say that he still shouldn't be in the UFC and most likely fighting for a title. I think if the UFC kept him, I think he probably would have already fought for the title, or he would have gotten like a Brandon Moreno or a Brandon Royval type of fight. But this is my pick for flyweight. I think it's the most obvious pick. Muhammad Mokaev still should be in the UFC. Dana White says they have no interest in picking him back up. I guess he was just extremely difficult to deal with. That's what he's saying. He was saying it wasn't because of his fight style. And I mean, look, if you look at his record, I think he was like 6 or 7-0 in the UFC, and I think only 2 of those went to decision. The Manel Kape fight being one of them, which we will all remember as like one of the most boring fights of all time, especially with the lead up that it had. They were talking so much shit, and we all thought they were just gonna like go out there and kill each other. But no, that is not what we got. We got an extremely boring fight from Manel Kape and Muhammad Mokaev, and subsequently Muhammad Mokaev gets let go from the UFC, and now he's just kind of fighting in like random regional promotions. Just got a sub in his last fight pretty easily. This dude is obviously UFC champion caliber. Like I said, we just didn't really appreciate him while he was here. Now, I also have an honorable mention for the flyweight division. This is the only one that I have an honorable mention for, so stick with me here. Just be patient. We'll get to bantamweight soon. But my honorable mention for flyweight is Jeff Molina. Now, Jeff Molina didn't make it quite as far as Muhammad Mokaev, but was undefeated in the UFC. I believe he came off the Contender Series and then came into the UFC. Went 3-0 in the UFC, if I'm not mistaken. Arichi Long, Daniel Lacerda, and Zalga Zumagulov, Coconut Head, beat Coconut Head in his last win. Which, winning a split decision over Zalgas is actually pretty good, especially when you're Jeff Molina. You're not really a grappler. You're more of a striker, and that's what he was. He was a really, really slick striker. Can't talk this morning. Sorry. Really, really good footwork. Really good angles. He trained under James Krause. A little bit of foreshadowing there. But Jeff Molina is my honorable mention for flyweight. I'm not exactly sure why he left the UFC. Like I said, he was training under James Krause, who got in trouble for the whole betting thing. I think he was betting on his own fighters or something like that. I don't really look too deeply into the non-fighting aspects of this shit, but I think that's what was going on with James Krause. And so Jeff Molina leaving the UFC might have had a little bit of something to do with that. But he was a good fighter, someone that I was really hoping to watch more. But unfortunately, we don't get to see him anymore. Let's move to bantamweight. My pick for the bantamweight fighter who left the UFC too soon, and this might be a little old for you guys if you're new to the sport, Chris Holdsworth. Now, Chris Holdsworth retired undefeated. He came through the Ultimate Fighter. He won the Ultimate Fighter like 12 years ago, like over a decade ago. And he was really good. He was more of a grappler, but he was coming out of that Team Alpha Male camp with Cody Garbrandt, TJ Dillashaw, Uriah Faber, all those guys. And so he wins the Ultimate Fighter, and then he comes into the UFC, and in his debut subs Davey Grant, who's still in the UFC today doing well. Chris Holdsworth was a really good talent, and as the story goes, don't quote me on this because I don't know if this is 100% true, but as the story goes, Chris Holdsworth was in training. I think they were doing sparring, and he was sparring with TJ, and I think the round ends. Chris Holdsworth kind of lets his guard down. TJ throws like a late knee at him or something, and I think injures him pretty badly. So I think his career was ended due to injury in training. I'm not, like I said, don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure on that story, but that's the story that I've heard. And over the decade, I haven't heard anything different. So I'm just going to continue believing that that's what ended Chris Holdsworth's career. Now, let's move up to featherweight, which I think a lot of you can probably predict this one. Zabit Magomedsharipov, great talent. One of these guys who like had a loss early on in his career and then went on a crazy streak. And you know, Zabit had his issues. You know, he had cardio issues. He had a real lack of power. Couldn't really knock people out. But he was a really good talent. People were saying, "Oh, this dude's going to be champ one day." I never really saw it, especially like his last fight in the UFC was that Calvin Kattar fight, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, Calvin Kattar. Before that, Jeremy Stevens. Before that, Brandon Davis. But in that Kattar fight, that was a big tell because if you remember like I do, Zabit beat the shit out of Kattar for the first 2 rounds, and then round 3 comes along, and Magomedsharipov just has nothing left in the tank. Kattar starts to put it on him. I mean, we all know how tough Kattar is. He's going to fight until the very end. But he was really putting it on Magomedsharipov in that fight. And I remember just being like, well, if there's a round 4, Zabit is absolutely done. I believe he left the UFC to become a doctor. I'm almost positive. And, you know, since he's left, we've seen a couple clips of him back in the gym training, hitting pads and that. But I don't think he's coming back. Zabit is gone for good. Would he have become champion? Probably not, in my eyes. How would he do today in the featherweight division? Probably not well. There's people in the division now that are super skilled that can adjust. And look, he was in the division before Ilya showed up. I'm pretty sure when last time he fought, I think Max was still the champion, or maybe Volk had just taken the belt from him for the first time. But either way, Zabit is my pick for featherweight fighters who left the UFC too soon. Whether or not I think he would have become champion, I think if he was in the UFC today, he'd still be in the top 10 putting on good fights. So that's my pick for featherweight. Now my pick for lightweight, Gregor Gillespie. You know, Gregor Gillespie, I think what a lot of people remember about Gregor Gillespie's career is getting knocked out by Kevin Lee, which was probably Kevin Lee's best performance in the UFC. But before that, Gregor Gillespie was undefeated. He was destroying everybody that he was fighting, to be completely honest. He was like, you know, really, really solid American wrestler who learned how to strike decently well. And he was doing a really, really good job in the UFC until he ran into Kevin Lee. But then, that wasn't even his last fight in the UFC. A lot of people remember it as Gregor Gillespie getting knocked out by Kevin Lee and then leaving the UFC to become a fisherman or something like that. But no, he came back and had a fight with Carlos Diego Ferreira and TKO'd him. Carlos Diego Ferreira is still, I picked him to win in his last fight a couple months ago. So Gregor Gillespie, he's my pick for lightweight fighters who left the UFC too soon. I think he had a lot of promise. Now that he's been gone for a couple years, I think he's probably going to be past his prime. So I think we'll kind of never know what Gregor Gillespie could have been had he just stayed in the UFC after the Carlos Diego Ferreira win. I think the reason why he hasn't taken a fight since that last one is because I think he was waiting for like a high name, a bigger name opponent. I think he's like one of these guys who kind of believed his own hype and was like, well, I'm being hyped up by the fans and by the UFC, so I'm waiting until I get a big fight. And I think the big fight just kind of never came. And now that I'm looking at this dude, tell me his nose doesn't look exactly like Steve Erceg's nose. This dude, I mean, take away like his hair and his body, this dude kind of looks like Steve Erceg. Either way, Gregor Gillespie, he's my pick for lightweight fighters who left the UFC too soon. Now, 170 welterweight fighter who left the UFC too soon. I mentioned him earlier on in this video as a coach, but as a fighter, James Krause was good, man. I don't know if you guys remember James Krause's fights, but he's good. I mean, you could tell when he fights that he was a coach because he kind of like was very strategic, very patient, very calm in there, and put on some really, really good performances. His last 3 fights, I mean, Sergio Moraes, Trevin Giles, he lost to Trevin Giles, but that ain't bad. I think that was his only loss in the UFC, was to Trevin Giles. And then Silva has a win over Silva, his last fight decision. But James Krause, I think he came into the UFC, went on like a 5 or 6 fight win streak until he ran into Trevin Giles, and then he lost. But then he came back, got another win, and then I think after that is when he got in trouble. Well, this last win that he had was, when was that? 2020. I think it was like 2022 or 2023 that he got in trouble for, I think it was something to do with betting. But to be honest with you, I'm not entirely up to date on that situation of why they don't let James Krause coach or fight in the UFC anymore. Either way, he was a good fighter. I think, like I said, I think he was like 6-1 or 7-1 in the UFC and then got in trouble and subsequently let go. So we'll never really know how good James Krause was, but he's my pick for 170. Let's move on to 185. I think this is the most obvious pick for 185. Gegard Mousasi. And sorry, you guys have to deal with the poor quality. For some reason, like a couple of these guys on the UFC website, their photo just kind of sucks. Gegard Mousasi. And look at his record. 42-6-2. That's not even his real record. He has like 49 wins. I think he's like 49-6 or 49-7, something like that. Might be one of the best MMA records of all time. Gegard Mousasi, I mean, he went through a little bit of adversity in the UFC, but I think Gegard Mousasi is one of the best middleweight fighters that the UFC's ever seen. I mean, he had that, I think it was like in 2018 or 2019, he had that TKO loss to Uriah Hall, and then after that went on a crazy streak. Beat, I'm trying to remember who he beat after leaving or after losing to Uriah Hall. I know he TKO'd Thiago Santos. He TKO'd Chris Weidman, was his last fight in the UFC, TKOing Chris Weidman. I think he also TKO'd, oh man, I don't know. I forget who was in between Thiago Santos and Chris Weidman. It's kind of slipping my mind right now. But he went on like a 4 or 5 fight knockout streak. And his streak ending with Chris Weidman. And then I think his contract was up. And I think he just didn't like the UFC. I think he was saying it, I remember him going on the Ariel Helwani show when he was a free agent, or he had maybe just signed to Bellator. And he was saying it was just because the UFC didn't respect him. I think he was getting paid relatively like the same amount of money in the UFC as what Scott Coker and Bellator was offering him. But I think he was just saying Scott Coker respected him a lot more, and he just wanted to fight for Bellator, which in my eyes is a shame, because coming off a KO win over former middleweight champion Chris Weidman, I mean, especially at the time when he did it, puts you in a really good position to be fighting for the title. So Gegard Mousasi, my pick the middleweight who left the UFC too soon. Now we got two left. This next one is a little bit sad in retrospect, but my pick for light heavyweight, Anthony Rumble Johnson. I don't know a single person who dislikes Anthony Rumble Johnson. I mean, this dude was such a good dude. Unfortunately, passed away a couple years ago, but he went out on a win. You know, he's another guy. He fought his last fight in Bellator. He won by KO, and it was at heavyweight, I think. And it's so crazy. Like, if you guys remember Anthony Rumble Johnson, he started at middleweight or light heavyweight, but when he got to the UFC, he decided to cut down to 170, which is insane because Rumble was just huge, and the power that he had was insane. I think to this day, maybe one of the heaviest-handed fighters that's ever fought in the UFC. But he started in the UFC at 170, worked his way, obviously having trouble making weight, moved up to middleweight, then fought the majority of his UFC career at light heavyweight, and did his best work at light heavyweight. His last win in the UFC was a knockout that will be on highlight reels for the remainder of the history of mixed martial arts. Sorry, I'm kind of like stumbling over my words today, but either way, that's just how good Anthony Rumble Johnson was, bro. I can't even think. I'm just remembering all his crazy fights. But his knockout over Glover Teixeira in like 9 seconds. And at that time, I mean, Glover Teixeira was still like not super old. He was a couple fights removed from the John Jones loss. Glover Teixeira was. But either way, we hadn't seen anybody do that to Glover Teixeira, and Rumble Johnson just goes out there and knocks him out in 9 seconds. Absolutely crazy. After that, I think after that he got a title shot against Daniel Cormier and then got subbed, if I'm remembering that correctly. Let's go down here. Yes, he did. He got subbed by Daniel Cormier. That was his last fight in the UFC. And then he left because I think he just, he didn't want to fight anymore. I think he was struggling with wanting to stay in the fight game after that loss to Cormier. Had a couple other business ventures and then started doing some heavy lifting and got absolutely huge. It looked like at one point he was like over 300 pounds, like 320 pounds or something like that. He was huge. And then he decided, I want to come back to fighting. Had that fight in Bellator where he got the knockout. And then I think a couple months later, he passed away. Very, very unfortunate. We'll miss you, Anthony Rumble Johnson. Thank you for everything you've done. Either way, that's my pick for light heavyweight fighters who left the UFC too soon. Sorry, this is getting a little rambly. But we're on to our last one. Heavyweight. Heavyweight fighter who left the UFC too soon. I think this is pretty obvious. Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou right now, you could still call him, top 3 best heavyweight MMA fighters in the world. Obviously we got John Jones. Obviously we got Tom Aspinall. But Francis Ngannou is right up there in the conversation. He's not in the UFC anymore, but when you talk about heavyweight MMA fighters, people are still talking about Francis Ngannou. Obviously, he suffered his first UFC loss to Stipe Miocic by a very strategic, methodical performance by Stipe. But he got that back, and he got that back pretty solidly. He, came out a lot more patient. I mean, that was after people started talking about, after he beat Stipe in the rematch, people were like, oh my God, patient Francis Ngannou is the greatest fighter we've ever seen. If you remember, Stipe, stood up with him for a little bit, tried to take him down, and just could not take Francis down. He was like a brick wall. Francis actually sprawls on him, spins behind the back, starts landing shots. Stipe stands up, and then, a little bit, not too much further into that fight, Stipe got knocked out with a left hook. Beautiful left hook, folds him. And that was Francis Ngannou's last fight in the UFC, if I'm remembering correctly. There might be another one. oh my God, I'm an idiot. Yes, he absolutely dominated Cyril Gane after that. How can I forget? But either way, Francis Ngannou still should be in the UFC today. His last MMA fight, beating the Bellator champ, who everyone at Bellator was saying, oh, this is the guy to beat Francis. He's huge, he's athletic, he's this, whatever. Francis Ngannou, still, in my opinion, one of the best heavyweight fighters in history. I think if he came back to the UFC right now, I think he'd have a great fight against Aspinall. I think he's a little bit too slow to beat John Jones. I think he'd have a great fight against Aspinall, though. But either way, if he was still in the UFC today, he'd be a major, major player and one of the greatest heavyweight fighters of all time. Those are my picks from flyweight to heavyweight of fighters that left the UFC too soon. Please let me know in the comments if you could think of anybody that I left out or maybe deserves to be in the spot over somebody that I picked. But those are the guys who I think left the UFC too soon. Thank you for watching. We got a couple weeks without fights, so I figured I'd just do a fun little video like this. But like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed. Catch you on the next one. Adios.
What fighter has the highest fight IQ?
I don't think there's nobody in the game that has the fight IQ that I have.
Off the charts.
His IQ
the
is
highest
insane.
fight IQ maybe ever.
This guy hits hard. He's tough. He's this, he's that. And this guy has a dream. But my fight IQ will win this fight.